Welcome back. And joining me now, author William Dalrymple, whose new book, White Moguls, which is about the Indo-British encounter in the 18th century, is climbing bestseller lists everywhere. Thank you very much for joining me, William. A foray into 18th century Indian history, quite different from your line of work, which is normally been contemporary and travel books about India and the Middle East. How did you hit upon the subject in time?
Well, not so different, in fact, because although the other books are travel books, they're all very historical. And while this is technically a history book, it's full of sense of place. So I didn't feel actually that it was doing something terribly new. It was just slightly redirecting, slightly juggling the same pack of cards. In City of Jinns, which is a book I wrote 10 years ago, there is a character called William Fraser, and he's my wife's ancestor. And he absolutely falls in love with India and adopts Mughal ways in Delhi when he was the British resident, early 19th century. And when I published that book, I thought he was unique. I thought he was a one-off. And I got more and more letters from people saying, actually, my great-great-grandfather was just like that. And they'd enclose some photograph of some fantastic-looking character with a beard, with sort of turban and puggree and jama and everything. And it turns out, of course, that it is a whole period of history which has been suppressed, which has been written out of the records by embarrassed Victorians, and a very important period of history.
At the heart of White Moguls is a love story between the British resident in Hyderabad, James Achilles Kirkpatrick, and a Hyderabadi aristocrat, Khairun-Nisa. It's really the nugget around which your entire book and story revolves. How did you come upon that story?
Well, the book had already... I'd been researching a book on British who assimilated themselves to India at this period for 2 whole years, and had spent my entire advance when I discovered not this story, but the full documentation which enabled this one story to colonize the entire book. It's a story that's well known. Bilkis Aladdin in Hyderabad has written a lovely little monograph on it in a play. It isn't as if it's a new story. What is new is extraordinary volume of James's correspondence, his mother-in-law's Persian correspondence, and most remarkably of all, a 650-page Persian autobiography by her first cousin, never translated before, never used at all by historians.
Which you lit upon in the dim alleys of Hyderabad.
In one of these wonderful bits of serendipity that does occasionally come to people who persevere in these things.
William, what's also very exciting is that, comparatively speaking, when you look at colonial history, the Deccan and Hyderabad is much less written about than, say, the North, Agra or Delhi or Jaipur.
For every book on Hyderabad, there's a shelf on Lucknow and Delhi. Now, what's lovely is that this is not only a period of history which has been suppressed and which surprises people, it's also a part of India which is simply unwritten in modern times. You cannot go to a bookshop and buy a contemporary paperback about Hyderabad or the Deccan.
Right.
It is a great, great segment of Indian civilization that remains to be written.
And let's face it, British historians and colonists have been really the first suppressors of all this material of free living and this kind of symbiosis between the British and India in the early 18th century. They edited out all that material in subsequent stories, didn't they?
Quite literally. I mean, it wasn't just a kind of forgetfulness or an omission. You find biographies of worthies of this period, generals, residents, that in early editions published, say, in 1830, mention Indian wives and Anglo-Indian children. After 1850, after 1860, these passages are simply removed, airbrushed from the historical record. So it isn't a surprise, in a sense, that this does surprise us so much. We have believed the Victorians' version of events. It's as if the Victorians colonized not just India, but more permanently our imaginations, to the exclusion of all other images of the Indo-British encounter, so that we're left just with this Tom Alter figure over and over again in the Hindi films, exactly the same one-dimensional stereotype, or played in cheap BBC dramas by Edward Fox and John Gielgud.
Very much sort of Raj stereotype.
As if the 1890s had existed for 400 years, exactly.
But why do you think that period of the early 18th century, of this great cohabitation between the British and India, particularly in sexual matters, why do you think that was unique and exceptional? Because don't you think Indians and Europeans before and after have had relationships, because at the heart of your story are human beings and their emotions?
These relationships have existed throughout history, you're quite right, but very much they peak at certain times. I've been through every single will in the India Office Library from this period. In the 1780s, 1 in 3 British men is leaving everything to an Indian wife, or BB. Now, this is an extraordinary degree of multiculturalism, but it declines quickly. By 1810, it's 1 in 4. By 1820, it's 1 in 5. By 1840, it's between 1 and 6 and 7. And by the time of the mutiny, 1857, there are no legally registered cohabitations at all. So one sees the introduction of evangelical Christian morals. One moves in Britain from the world of Boswell whoring and drinking his way around the clubs and brothels of London to the world where everyone spends 7 hours in chapel listening to 5-hour-long sermons. I know which one I'd like to live in.
One of the interesting things you've done as a non-academic historian is to really take on various kinds of historians who are now slotted as colonial historians or nationalist historians or this new trendy thing of subaltern studies. What's the historian's reaction to your book been like, a journalist and a travel writer really taking them on home ground?
Well, you have to be very careful, and the book is minutely footnoted. Every single sentence, every single statement has back up from primary sources. So far, though, I have to say they've been very generous. I mean, there's been several mainstream academic South Asian historians, like Professor Francis Robinson, for example, who has written reams on Lucknow. He gave it a very long and detailed review in TLS and liked it very much. So far, so good. But I'm sure by the time the Subaltern Studies Collective gets onto it, I expect a little less charity may be in order.
Yes, but you do agree that history is an open subject, and the trouble with most academic histories is they tend to be so arid and dull and beyond the lay readership.
Well, exactly. Academic historians write for academic historians, and it's a kind of little sort of gossip between a closed club. But history is out there. History is there, and as long as you use sources carefully and are respectful of facts, history is there to be written. And this, what I think is new, is that this brings proper narrative history to a general readership in India for the first time. You can go in a European bookshop and buy Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, or Stella Tilliard's book Aristocrats, which is well-researched, minutely footnoted history, but it's written with a narrative, it's written with a story. And it should read with the pace and the interest of a novel.
Well, Barbara Tuchman, Simon Sharma, many of the great historians are doing it. It's just that...
But what's so strange, it hasn't happened in India. You have this wonderful efflorescence of fiction, but with the exception of Ram Guha and Pankaj Mishra, you've got virtually no Indians as yet writing non-fiction. Thank God, because I'd be out of a job if they were.
And also this is really the frontier between journalistic investigation in a way, and not quite fiction, but it is an excavation of the past. Yeah. You don't think it's an excavation of the past?
This is a work of history. It's not journalistic, it's not a novel. It is using the techniques of the novel in the sense of shaping narrative and plot carefully. But everything that happens is fact. It's not fiction, it's not faction even. In Italy, interestingly, they market it as a non-fiction novel, which isn't a bad description, in the sense that it should read like a novel, but it is non-fiction. It's strictly historically accurate.
And now the film of the book, we hear The White Moguls may be made into a film and Shekhar Kapoor may direct it. Is that right?
Well, we'll see the colour of his money. He's putting in a bid this week. But we both hope that Sabrina Doven, who wrote the Monsoon Wedding script, will be the scriptwriter. That would be wonderful. I think she writes the best dialogue of any Indian writer in any genre.
And our negotiations at quite an advanced stage, William?
Yeah, quite an advanced stage. So it's going nicely, shall we say.
Competitors. Thank you so much for talking to Limelight. All the very best for The White Moguls and your future books. Thank you. That's all for now, but I'll be back next weekend with another edition of Limelight. But if you want to watch any of these interviews and stories at your leisure and on broadband, do log on to our website, ndtv.com. Until next week, then, from all of us here, goodbye.